Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Joe Emilio Show. It's great to be back live streaming once again, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you guys so much for tuning in and showing some interest in this topic. I have with me two esteemed guests on the show, both of them from the same organization, Free Market Foundation. Links in the description, by the way, if you want to check them out. We're going to be talking about something some would say controversial. I say, well, the truth. To be honest, is the South African government the most racist government in the world? Recently, the IRR released a what they call a race law index, and apparently there were 142 race laws that exist in South Africa, higher than during the apartheid era. Crazy. So I have brought onto the show some individuals who know policy, who know economics, and we're going to talk about these race laws. We're going to give some examples, and we're also going to talk about why this is so important. Why does this affect the economy? And probably also talk about some other things. So ladies and gentlemen, please don't forget to share this stream, and also leave a question. If you have any questions about this topic, please leave the question in the comment section in the live chat. I will be keeping an eye on the live chat. I will mark it, and then later on in the show there will be a Q&A opportunity where we answer all your questions. And also, please give a super thanks or what we call a Sasa thanks, Sasa chat, if you will. It goes a long way to supporting the channel. With that being said, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to welcome on my guests to the show right now. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for David Ansara and the one, the only Mr. Martin van Staden.
Hello there.
Both these gentlemen, like I said, from the Free Market Foundation. But David, you are the CEO of the Free Market Foundation, and Martin, sorry, you are the head of policy, correct? Cool. Gentlemen, what can you tell us? What is the first thing you want people to know about this race law project or this index that was made? Martin, perhaps we should start with you. Enlighten us. What's the first thing you want people to know about this?
Well, I guess if we're talking about foreigners, it's that legislated racialism, legislated discrimination didn't end in South Africa in 1994 or the 1990s. This is something that has continued despite the very strong vibe that legislated discrimination stopped in the 1990s. And then I guess for South Africans, just that it's quite pervasive. I think there was always the understanding that there are race laws still in South Africa amongst all South Africans. Some of us call them what they are, race laws. Others call them redress or whatever. But I think what I want South Africans to know is that there are many, there are many race laws. I don't think any of them are quite as bad as those during the apartheid years. I know many people will be very uncomfortable with me saying that, but there are many, many race laws in South Africa today, and that is in itself a very problematic thing in a constitutional democracy that claims to be a non-racial one.
Yeah, and I think Martin's point there is very important because if we consider ourselves a constitutional democracy, this is my copy of the Constitution from 2005, so you can see it's a little bit careworn. The founding provisions of the Constitution, Chapter 1, literally the first clause says the Republic of South Africa is one sovereign democratic state founded on the following values: human dignity, the achievement of equality, and the advancement of human rights and freedoms. That's A. And then B, non-racialism and non-sexism. And unfortunately, it seems that Section 1 on non-racialism is more honored in the breach in South Africa. And I think that that's a very important constitutional value that we need to remind ourselves, in particular because of the history of racial discrimination and segregation in South Africa. If there is one country in which non-racialism should be paramount, it's South Africa. If you consider the ways in which people were discriminated against in their daily lives, who they could marry, where they could live, and this was essentially a repugnant system that use state power and coercion to classify people racially, and to assign rights and benefits and duties according to race. But yeah, I think part of the problem with the discourse, as Martin points out, is that there's this idea of redress, that we have to make right what was done in the past, and therefore naturally falling back on these racial categorizations, and again using state power and coercion to affect certain outcomes in the economy, and to allocate resources and privileges based on what are essentially kind of interpersonal characteristics. So I think we need to make non-racialism cool again, like it was in the mid 1990s. And unfortunately, we can go into some of the history of the race-based laws in post-apartheid South Africa. But I think the effect that it's having, not only on the economy but also in terms of social relations, I think is very damaging. But we can get into that in the conversation.
Yeah, and like, what's your guys' opinion on, because there's a lot of almost, I wouldn't say, I guess you can call it backlash, that I'll show a graph that was shared by you guys, and it's been making the rounds on social media. So this graph tells the whole story. I mean, we could see how the racial laws increase and then they drop in the 90, 94, around that period. And then they slowly start to increase, and we can see that the next peak is actually higher than during the apartheid years. But a lot of people I've seen a lot of people, at least on social media, and the social media, discourse is like, yeah, but right now there's nothing that's oppressing people. Right now, the blacks are free. They can do whatever they want. No one's like segregating people. Blah blah blah. And you mentioned, David, there's this narrative of redress, now almost as an excuse to allow some of these laws in. So what is your guys' response to that? David, we'll start with you.
Well, I mean, this relates to other questions where we're dealing with issues of infringement of people's rights in the past, like the land question, which is also very hot at the moment, is where the state did violate people's rights. There should be an appropriate mechanism to redress those past wrongs, and the state has a duty to correct those historical wrongs. But that doesn't mean infringing on the rights of other people in order to achieve that. I think that's a kind of a basic framework that we should be operating on. But we see this in the political debates a lot, that there's ideas like original sin, which I think is very damaging, because it's basically inescapable that you are responsible for the so-called sins of your forefathers, even if it's people who happen to look like you or share certain characteristics. Now you are attributed blame for that. So I think the discussion is all wrong. I mean, we're free marketeers. We believe in economic growth and opportunity as a big driver of prosperity. And the real problem in South Africa is that we have too many people who are suffering from lack of employment opportunities. Their income is constrained. We have the state that's too involved in the day-to-day affairs of people's lives, that's crowding out private enterprise. We have a very high tax burden, very high regulatory compliance burden, and that is what is keeping people subjected and stuck in poverty. And so what I think we need to do is change the conversation to say, well, how can we unlock opportunity? How can we drive growth and see everybody flourish in South Africa, black or white? And that's the beauty of a market-based economy, is that it doesn't actually discriminate. If you have a good or a service that you want to offer to the market, and people value that, they won't care too much about what your racial group is. They'll gravitate towards that good or that service. So I think often what gets lost in these conversations is, if you criticize BEE or some of the contemporary race-based laws, you're sort of accused of wanting to see the perpetuation of black poverty, that you're completely happy with with black people being on the margins of the economy, and and also I think the big fallacy is that only the state can deliver salvation. That left to their own devices, most black people in South Africa would not be able to achieve prosperity, which is a complete distortion, and we need to really reject that wholly. People have agency; they have a hunger to improve their lives. They have an ability to create value and to offer services that will not only help them but help the people that they're serving. So I think we want to see a flourishing black business community and other free enterprise like qualities, and I think that rising tide will lift all boats.
100%. You mentioned the BEE and stuff, which is something that a lot of people also point at as a race-based law, and it is. So let's get into some of the laws in this index. Martin, you and I were chatting very briefly about how some of the wokies on social media, all the social justice warriors, are making fun of this index. They're saying, "Oh, but it's just a list, man. It's just there's nothing here, And apparently, people don't know laws. Well, no surprise there. Not everyone's going to know, every law that exists in South Africa. But if you go to the index, which by the way is linked in the description below, ladies and gentlemen, you can see at the top corner, which I can't really show right now, but it says at the top corner, it says racial acts of parliament, total 317, operative 142. So if I'm not mistaken, it means there's 142 operative race-based laws. Martin, perhaps you can give us an example, because apparently this is just a list.
Well, look, yeah, it is just a list, and it's very self-consciously just a list. I mean, the idea for the index of race law, which kind of just some background, I constructed this on behalf of the Institute of Race Relations, where it still resides, and I continue to kind of update it and monitor race law in South Africa. Now, what sparked the idea for this was that there was a huge discourse a few years ago when I think it was Helen Zille and I think one or two other people said something like there are more race laws in South Africa today than during apartheid. And people laughed at her and people laughed at the other people who said this. And I was like, well, I mean, it's a very simple quantitative exercise to determine whether there are or are not more race laws in South Africa today than during apartheid. This is not something that we need to debate. So it kind of bothered me that this was something that we were debating. It's literally an exercise of counting. And the idea was to look at whether this is true or not. And that took about a year of really intense research to produce this list, which is a fluid list. I must kind of put the bottom line up front. And when the index was launched, this was all mentioned in the press release to say that this is a fluid thing. It's always kind of in flux. The numbers have changed many times. There's total transparency about that. Nothing is being hidden, and so on. But yeah, the ultimate conclusion was there are, in fact, more race laws in operation today than during apartheid. The peak during apartheid was 123 race laws, according to the current state of research, in the year 1980. And as we see, we now have 142 race laws on the books in this country. Again, the number may change. So just some examples. I think we all know the pre-94 laws. There are many more than people always refer to the Population Registration Act, the Group Areas Act, and so forth. And if you look at the pre-index of race law lists that the O'Malley Archive of the Nelson Mandela Foundation had, and a few other sources like Wikipedia's list of apartheid legislation, it's a few dozen at most, but really there were hundreds. So there are hundreds of apartheid era race laws, and they're all in there. But I mean, let's get into the post kind of apartheid race laws, which do not include BE and employment equity, which are the kind of well-known ones that a lot of the people on Twitter, as you pointed out, Joe, they say that the only real race laws is BE and employment equity. What are you talking about with these others? Now, I've kind of made a list of a few here just to kind of note to listeners and the audience what there is. I think the first thing to note is most post-apartheid race laws fall into the category of what is called representativity. Now, distinguish that from affirmative action for a moment. Representativity means that the let's say the Architects Professions Act, to take an example, has a council that controls the profession, and the act says that this council must reflect the demographic profile of the country. There are hundreds of these laws on the post-apartheid statute book. Of almost every act, really, that creates a notable government institution that has some governing authority says that the governing authority must reflect the demographic profile of South Africa. Now, that is the majority of post-apartheid race law, and I have argued to an AfriForum and the Solidarity audience very publicly that I think these laws are basically they're stupid and they're harmful, but they are not. They don't really rise to the level of BEE and employment equity, which are focused on the private sector, because these really put a handbrake on the economy. So what I told the AfriForum and Solidarity audience is that even if these laws didn't exist, because their primary critique, and the correct critique, is that these laws are used to kind of put friends and family on these government institutions. The minister appoints their sisters, husbands, cousin, or whatever, and now they are kind of back channeled onto a very important government body. That is true. But my argument is that even in the absence of that law, the ANC will be able to find people of all races to kind of put on these bodies. And I made the point that even if the law was reversed and it said that white people must be disproportionately represented on government bodies, the ANC will have no shortage of white friends to put on these bodies. So to me, it's kind of a non-issue. But there are others. So the 1997 Housing Act, the act that regulates the housing market in South Africa, says that the government may record racial information regarding home ownership in a what they call a data bank. Now, I know a lot of people think it's innocuous for government to record racial information, but as we saw during the previous kind of regime, the recording of racial information is the first step to the weaponization of that information towards some social engineering end. So I don't see this at all as an innocuous provision. The 1998 is the year with the most race laws adopted in a single year post-apartheid. I think the number is 20 in that year. The 1998 Forests Act says that any decision that the government makes regarding forests, South Africa's plentiful forests, must be guided by how they advance the previously disadvantaged. I'll say something about the terminology soon. The same act says that the government must provide support, in particular, to small-scale foresters who fit the bill of previously disadvantaged. And there's a very similar provision in the 1998 Marine Living Resources Act, which is kind of fishing thereabouts. The latest, the 2013 Superior Courts Act, that is the law that regulates our highest courts, the high courts, the Supreme Court of Appeal, and the Constitutional Court, that has a provision very early on in the purpose of the act. These are kind of the principles that guide how the law should be read and so on. Says that the imperative of transformation, or the constitutional imperative of transformation, must guide how the courts in South Africa are structured. Now, a lot of people, I'm sure, will say that I have now read race into the idea of transformation. But if you look at how the Department of Justice, which is the responsible department for the structuring of the courts, how they interpret that constitutional imperative of transformation, it is always racial. It is always racial. Yes, it is also gender and people with disabilities and everything, but it is always also racial. there is no exception of what the imperative of transformation means. And you can read that in the judgments. It's usually solidarity saying that, hey, this white magistrate wasn't promoted, and then the Department of Justice comes back and says, well, we have too many magistrates. The constitutional imperative of transformation says we can't promote him. So that's kind of what it comes down to. So the Superior Courts Act does no reference to white, black, colored, or Indian. It has no reference to previously or historically disadvantaged, but it has this reference to transformation. And that's just to show that what the index looks at is also coded terminology, or what you might say euphemistic language. This happened under apartheid. Native became Bantu, Bantu became black, but then also colored became community. So when previously the law referred to what must happen with coloreds, the National Party eventually started talking about community development. That meant colored communities. And when it came to black South Africans, there was this idea of national development, the nationals, and the national states. It's very euphemistic, but it refers to black South Africans. And that's the case today with historically or previously disadvantaged and transformation. These are coded terms for race. And then just the two newest race laws in South Africa today. The 2024 Public Procurement Act, very important stuff. This is how you get services to the poor. This is how you build highways. This is how you kind of contract with the government. And this repeated something from the now repealed Preferential Procurement Act from 2000. And it basically says that when the government procures, or when any organ of state procures, it must have a preferential procurement policy that has the set-asides for people based on race. So you can only contract, or you are entitled to a certain kind of domain of government contracts if you are of a certain composition as a company. And it also brings in BEE points that you get, or that are recorded into whether you get to bid or not. And then the very newest race law, which is complicated because it is this is something that the post-apartheid government has also done. It retrospectively racialized non-racial acts from the apartheid era. I know that's a big thing to wrap your head around, but the apartheid government also adopted acts that were non-racial. One of these was the Deeds Registries Act. This is kind of how you record who owns a house and so on. We're all kind of familiar with a title deed. This is the act that kind of regulates that. This was a non-racial act adopted by the previous regime. Non-racial act, and now in 2024 or 2025, the post-apartheid government adopts the Deeds Registries Amendment Act. And what this does is it amends that old act, and it gives the minister the power to now record again the racial demographics of homeowners in a slightly different context from the Housing Act. But again, so now it's an apartheid era law that's non-racial, that's been racialized. These are the two newest race laws. So that's a taste. But again, there's 117 of these have been adopted since apartheid ended, and 142 counting apartheid era laws that are still in work, still in operation, or that have been retrospectively racialized. That's the kind of the situation we currently find ourselves in.
Wow. And just a little bit of an anecdotal addition to what you're saying. Like, we recently were blessed to be able to, buy a house, and I do remember that in the forms on the government, not government, but like the forms that you fill out to apply. They asked our race, and my wife and I were still like, why? Why does it matter? But anyway. Okay, cool. So one thing that I also wanted to touch on very quickly is, again, wokies, lefties going crazy about this stuff, trying to, just make fun of the whole situation. And you said earlier that you put this whole list together. And, I just kind of want to show people how to kind of use this information, because it seems that it's too much effort for some people. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to know, because I think I know what people want. People want to be able to go to the website, click on the act, and then automatically it pops up what the racist part of the act is. But that takes a lot of manpower to be able to, code a website to do that, and maybe that's a future project to do. But either way, you have made it. You've basically given them the act, right? You say, hey, this act, this is the one that's racist, and all you have to do, for those of you who are wondering, is if you choose any act here. Okay, let's go with the Liquor Act, for example, because I think a lot of people would be surprised. Why is the Liquor Act in there? How is that racist? Blah blah blah. Right? And all you have to do, ladies and gentlemen, is Google Liquor Act. Okay, and then you're gonna get to the PDF, and then use any of the words, the code words that Martin recently spoke of just now: transformation, BE, or black, or whatever, right? And boom, you will find the part that is probably racist. Like take the Liquor Act for example. Conditions of license. In addition to the authority set out in Section 17, the minister may review and propose new conditions on registration if the registrant, okay, and we go to B, has not met its commitments in terms of black economic empowerment and cannot provide adequate reasons for failing to do so. Martin, what does that mean?
Yeah, so I mean, they've attached BE compliance to being licensed as someone who does business in the liquor industry. You showed the funny thing here is that some of the viewers might pick up is that you had the old Liquor Act highlighted in the index. So there's been 4 Liquor Acts, I think, 3 or 4, and all of them have been racial. And you had the 1928 one highlighted, but the screen you just shared was from the current Liquor Act of, I think, 2003, and that is a racial act. Now, again, this is a list. It was meant to be simple, and that doesn't mean that the list is foolproof. There are probably mistakes in the list. This is a kind of something that I've been very transparent about. I'm only one person, and I make mistakes, and on the race law website, it says that if you spot any errors in the index, please tell us and we'll fix it, and we have. But the most vocal critics of the index, they have never reached out. They have never said, hey, you bloody racists, here we have the list of we checked this act, there's no racial provisions in there, take it off. Because if they did that, we would, but they don't, because I mean the work was done. We didn't just willy-nilly kind of randomly pick and choose apartheid and post-apartheid laws to put in the index. We picked laws that have racial provisions, and yes, it is part of the future of the index to specify the provisions, but that is not an obligation on us. Nothing is hidden here. We didn't pull out the number out of a hat and say, there's these mysterious kind of 142 race laws somewhere in South Africa. It's like, we can be fact checked very quickly and very immediately. And again, I encourage people to do so, because this thing doesn't really work if it's not accurate. And with time, you want to get it as close to perfectly accurate as it possibly can be. I happen to think, and I'm fairly certain, that it is basically accurate, because when it changes, it's usually by adding a new race law and removing an old one, and the numbers tend to change very little. But I think we're basically there. And another future kind of aspect of it is to start looking at, because this is an aspect that is not accounted for in the index, is that the most pernicious race laws in South Africa today have nothing to do with the number of race laws. It is one act, really. It's one act. And that's called the Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment Act of 2003. That is one race law. On this index, it is represented as a single data point, one. But in terms of that act, there are dozens upon dozens of what is called sector codes. These are not acts of parliament, but these are as binding as an act of parliament. And these are where the real harm from race law comes into South Africa. And in the future, the index will record regulations and kind of policy charters like that. It doesn't now, but these numbers and this graph will change when the capacity to do that additional research comes about, and that's really where the real meat and potatoes of harmful race law in post-apartheid South Africa is. Because as I said earlier, most of the kind of data point race laws, the Geomatics Professions Act, the Environmental Management Act, for instance, these all have councils that must be broadly representative of the racial profile of the country. I don't think that has huge economic impact. It certainly does have economic impact. I don't think it has huge economic impact. Certainly not as much as compared to the Groups Areas Act, the kind of Mines and Works Act of the previous dispensation that said if you are black, you may not work above a certain pay grade in the mines. I mean, that's huge economic impact. So, yes, the index doesn't provide the full story. It doesn't pretend to provide the full story. What it does say, and what it does, I think, provide very accurately, is show that the South African Parliament, the one that sits in Cape Town, has adopted since 1994, 117 acts of parliament that have some or other either direct or coded reference to race. And that alone says something. That says something about whether this government is a non-racial one. That says something about whether this government trusts black people to actually empower themselves, and they don't. They simply don't. And David alluded to this earlier. This government sees empowerment as a zero-sum game, which it isn't. Empowerment is something that each individual will do if allowed, and this government does not allow people to empower themselves. This government insists on doing the empowering, and thus it must treat it as a zero-sum game, because it's all ultimately about state power. And in time, the index will record all the various manifestations of that, in addition to acts of parliament.
I look forward to seeing that data. I really do. And this is perfect now for me to go to David, and we can talk about. So we know now what the race laws. There's a whole index there. People can go and look at these acts and search for themselves. But David, I think there's a very important point that needs to be told to the audience that is watching and future audience that might watch this. What's the big deal? You know, again, it's not apartheid. You know, most black people, white people can go out. They can sit in a restaurant. They can sit on a bench. They can sit on a bus. There's not real discrimination. You know, how do these race laws, maybe not all of them, but some of them, affect economic growth? And what Martin said as well, you know, how does it prove that the government doesn't trust black people to grow because they just want to regulate? Yeah. What's your take?
So I just want to come in on what Martin was saying. So I think a lot of the people who have been very animated in their criticism of Martin's excellent research, I think what they're objecting to is not necessarily, oh, the quantum of race laws. Did Martin get every single piece of legislation? Is it 142 laws, or is it 140 or 141? I think that's beside the point. I think what is causing such a vociferous reaction to Martin's research is actually that people are objecting to the equivalence of saying, oh, those apartheid laws, those are bad vibes. But the post-1994 racialized laws, those are good vibes. And Martin's research points out, well, actually, if you're serious about non-racialism, you should apply it equally, regardless of the political dispensation that happens to be in power. And I think this is really, maybe I can actually share my screen here. But I think this was really exemplified, the way that people talk past each other. Can you see my screen there?
No.
Anyway, maybe I'll just, basically, this was when the heat was being turned up on the Expropriation Act, and Cyril Ramaphosa, he was responding to some of the criticism that was coming out of the United States. This was he tweeted or posted on X on the 3rd of February. He said, South Africa is a constitutional democracy that is deeply rooted in the rule of law, justice and equality. The South African government has not confiscated any land. And then he goes on, to criticize the United States. And then Elon Musk reposted that and said, why do you have openly racist ownership laws? Which I think was a perfectly valid question from Elon Musk. I mean, Elon Musk has been trying to open Starlink in South Africa. Many African countries are benefiting from Starlink, and Starlink is brilliant technology for a continent like Africa, which doesn't necessarily always have the telecoms infrastructure. It's a very large, expansive continent, many remote areas that would benefit from access to this technology. But Musk, quite correctly, in my view, refuses to pay the punitive toll that the South African government wants to extract in terms of its BEE requirements, which would essentially force Starlink to cede some of its ownership to a local partner and enrich that person without that person or entity really adding any extra value. And often that goes to political elites, to cronies who are well connected. It's not going to a poor working class black guy who's living in the townships. And then you had Thuli Madonsela responding, saying, reversal of the consequences of racism through remedial or restitutive justice laws and other measures is not racism. Even before you inform yourself of South Africa's Constitutional Court jurisprudence, note Article 1.4 of the Convention on the 1965 International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. So Madonsela there is thinking that, okay, well, no, actually, this is good form of racial discrimination rather than the bad form, which is for restitutive purposes. So I think therein, I mean, the fact that she didn't even see her own contradictory logic there, that she was at once excusing racial classifications and other measures, but then also citing international jurisprudence on the elimination of racial discrimination. I think that contradiction shows the fallacies in that kind of logic. Yeah, I'll stop sharing now. But yeah, so I think we're not really talking about the same thing. Is my point. And I think often when people are using this term restitution, which I think is important, actually what they mean is retribution, which is not, I think, a helpful way of approaching how to build a free and open society where everybody has opportunities. And so I think, we also often hear this term equality. We need racial redress to achieve equality. And we as classical liberals are very big on one form of equality, which is equality of rights, that everybody is afforded the same rights. That doesn't necessarily mean that they all have the same stuff or the same capabilities. But I think in a lot of the conversations coming out of the so-called wokies, as you describe them, Joe, is that we need some form of good social engineering to to tip the scales that everybody has equality of outcome. And I think ultimately what underpins this idea of equality of outcome is, as Martin says, a form of social engineering, that you are going to create this idealized vision of society and you're prepared to use violent force in order to achieve that. And that might sound extreme and dramatic, but ultimately when you're dealing with state rules, these are underpinned by coercion. Like if you disobey the laws, they're going to come after you, they're going to fine you. If you don't pay the fine, they're going to imprison you, etc. And I think in South Africa, we have this weird condition where there's a lot of non-compliance, and the state has this vast scope. It's trying to do all these things, trying to engineer outcomes, but is often unable to enforce its own rules. And I think therein lies an opportunity for people who really care about non-racialism and who want to grow businesses and create prosperity in this country, is to say, well, actually, a lot of the perpetuation of these systems actually relies on people complying. And how did South Africa end the apartheid system? Well, there are lots of different forces at play, but one of the big forces was non-compliance. So we've mentioned the Institute of Race Relations. Both Martin and I have, in various points in our careers, worked for the Institute, and the Institute has a very storied history. And John Kane Berman, who was the long-time, now late former CEO of the Institute, he wrote a book in the 1980s called South Africa's Silent Revolution. And it was about how black workers were moving to the cities in open defiance of some of the population control measures. And the police and authorities were simply unable to enforce their own laws. And eventually, the reality just became so overwhelming that the state had to concede that its laws were no longer working. And I think in South Africa, we need to start having a similar conversation about BE. We need to recognize that this is ultimately about the politicization of the economy. It's not so-called restitution. It's not about empowerment. It's not about transformation. These words have been used and abused, and their original meaning has been distorted for political ends. So ultimately, this is about elite enrichment. And I think very good to look at the work that another civil society organization, Sakelige, has been doing on BE. And I think their framework is very good. So they talk about the 3 waves of BE. So the first wave was post-94, where you had political pressures to open up economic activity to Black South Africans, which I think was mostly a good thing. But then it wasn't statutory driven. So then you had the second wave of BE, and that was the broad-based Black economic empowerment, really, 2003, the Triple BE Act. And that sought to use state procurement as the principal driver of transformation. So if you wanted to do business with the government, if you want to sell the government any goods or provide services to the state, then you need to have certain level of compliance and ownership of your business. And then the third wave of BE is actually controlling and restricting permission to firms based on their racial makeup and their ownership profile. And I think that is extremely dangerous, where you're now giving the state power to ultimately grant or withdraw your ability to do business at all. So Sakelige has been running a very public campaign with regards to agri-BE. So this is BE codes applying in the agricultural sector. And they've been asking the Minister of Agriculture, John Steenhuisen, to explain why he's signed off on some of these transformation funds, which will add levies onto farmers to contribute to transformation. And the minister has said, well, look, there's a lot of disparities in ownership, and this is very unequal. We don't have fair participation in the agriculture sector. But ultimately, what the minister is doing, and he's a DA minister and the leader of the DA, he's basically enforcing the ANC's political program, their machinery to extract value out of the economy. So, we talk about non-compliance, but, I think that was a big opportunity that Minister Steenhuisen missed, to actually push back against some of these codes and to say, under my watch, we're not going to perpetuate this system. So I think it's very regrettable that he's come out very defensively against Sakelige's, I think, quite correct questions around why this system continues to be continued or perpetuated.
Joe, can I add something there onto what David was saying?
Of course, yeah.
So this is something that's gotten me in a lot of trouble, and I'm okay with getting in trouble about it again. It's to say that, and David alluded to this about good vibes and bad vibes, you cannot evaluate laws based on what they're intended to do, or in our current kind of constitutional court parlance, which what Maroncella is referring to, what they're designed to do. The apartheid government, the architects of apartheid, bad people, in my view, authoritarians, illiberal, misguided. They did not sit around in dark rooms, twirling their mustaches, saying, yes, we're going to get the blacks now. They had good intentions that they were warned would result in complete and utter disaster, just like the IRR, the FMF, is warning the current government that their good intentions will and are and is resulting in complete disaster. But you cannot sit in 2025 South Africa and say that the race laws prior to 1994 are invalid because they were somehow malicious or adopted with bad intentions, and those adopted in and after 1994 are valid and good because somehow they were adopted with good intentions. That is a completely unsustainable way to approach policy analysis. You cannot do it that way, because in the moment, in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, it is not like the ANC itself was calling the National Party people who were trying to maliciously destroy the black community. They engaged with the South African Party government first, the United Party government, and with the National Party government before they started their armed struggle, on the assumption that this is a misguided way to achieve what the National Party wanted, which was for separate nations to govern themselves. That was their grand program. They did not want the various racial groups to be able to impose themselves on one another. And of course, they allowed whites to impose themselves on others. But that was the intention behind this system. Now, it cannot be as easy as simply as discovering today, oh goodness, the that act from the apartheid era had good intentions, therefore, geez, damn it, now we can't criticize apartheid anymore. I mean, that is utterly bizarre. We cannot have that as our method of analysis. And when you construct something like an index of race law, you cannot ask the people who construct it to now go and sit and decide, in Hansard, which is the parliamentary debate record, the minister who introduced this law, he said it's for a good reason. But my goodness, I think it's for a bad reason. It's bad vibes race law. And then, oh no, but the ANC and this in 2022, they adopted this law for good vibes reasons. So that's not, you cannot approach public policy that way. And for a jurist like Tuli Madonsela, who did such wonderful work as public protector, to make such a very basic kind of error in analyzing policy, appealing to the judgment record of the Constitutional Court, as if the courts during apartheid did not also just wash away the kind of bad vibes of those laws and say that there is a good purpose here, as if that did not happen. It is utterly bizarre. And we don't just look at even the consequences of these laws. Race law per se is a problem, and this is something that's missed. You cannot take something that individuals have no control over, none of us decide how we are born, and weaponize that either against them or use that as a way to uplift them, because either way they did not make that decision, and you as a lawmaker cannot use such a thing for or against someone. And that is why, even if apartheid, like a lot of people who are proponents of race law today say that, oh, but those laws worked for the Afrikaner. They uplifted Afrikaners. Therefore, we must do the same. Even if you believe apartheid was wonderful, it is still wrong per se to put race in law. Again, because we have no control over that. It is the kind of the perfection of unfairness. So yeah, I just think this is another thing, as David has said, that's lost in how we talk about these things. If your basic kind of way to approach these things is to judge these laws by their intentions, you're in big trouble. You're in very big trouble, because most oppression around the world really ultimately is going to be based on some appeal by a politician to some grand ideal that they are striving towards, and then everything just falls apart. So you have to ask yourself, the consequences, sure, very important, key, but also, is what is being done per se problematic in the act itself? Is that something that is by the very nature of the act problematic? And I think when people start thinking about it that way, we will find that South Africans actually agree about a whole lot more regarding race law than currently the discourse shows. Because I think most South Africans, even those who approve of race law, would have to agree that the ideal scenario is that there must be no race law. that you may not use people's race for or against them. I think they must agree to that. And once they make that concession and they think it through, they'll realize, well, then you can't really go back and judge these things by their intentions. Then you have to judge it by whether the act itself, the conduct itself, is problematic. So yeah, I just wanted to add that thing about intentions.
No, and it's a very valid point, and I think, like, I'm 100% with you guys. Like, there shouldn't be any race laws, right? I'm also, I think, to a certain extent, a free marketeer. I'm a big fan of the Free Market Foundation. And I believe that, if there wasn't so many race laws, that South Africa or South Africans wouldn't be suffering so much. But before we move on, I just wanted to, Martin, you sent me something and I don't want to forget to show it. Just explain, because this is the same graph, right? This is the same graph that we showed earlier. But yeah, so apparently it's been turned into a meme now.
I wanted to take my criticism seriously. They said, as David said, they think I'm equivocating between apartheid era race laws and new era kind of democratic era race laws, and I think this just shows that no, I'm not. There's a clear look. There's a difference. One has good vibes and one has bad vibes.
Did you
So,
design this, Martin?
yes, yeah, no, I made this because it becomes tiresome after a while to keep telling people, listen, this thing counts race laws and it discounts intentions. Because if you want me to now go in and decide whether a law has a good or a bad intention, then I mean, there's nothing that can be done. So I think this is a very good compromise to just acknowledge that, okay, cool. Post-apartheid race laws are for restitution, and pre-94 race laws are for separation. So good vibes, bad vibes. I hope this kind of satisfies my critics' issue with the graph and the index.
That's great. Just before we start wrapping up, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, now is the time to pop them in the chat. I have been keeping an eye on some of the questions. Keep it relative to Free Market Foundation and the race index, if there's anything specific you want to know about that. I do want to ask one more question, and both of you will have the opportunity to answer it. David, you kind of alluded to it earlier, but in your guys' opinion, in your professional opinion, what is the answer here? I mean, do we go to the streets and we protest? Do we sign 1 million petitions for each act? Do we, I don't know, what is the solution in order to convince the ANC? Or maybe it's voting. Do we vote the ANC out? Will that help? I don't know. David, to start with you, what do you think is the solution to kind of backtrack on some of these race laws and be a bit more of a freer society in a sense?
Yeah, great question. Well, there are a number of tools at your disposal. So some of them are more effective than others. So I think the first step that you need to take is to first debase yourself or disabuse yourself of this idea that BE necessarily leads to economic upliftment and transformation of Black people's economic situation. I think it's very beneficial for a very narrow elite who are politically connected. So it is a political program. So I think you need to separate those ideas. But I think trying to persuade the ANC that they're on the wrong track, I think a lot of people for many decades have tried to do that. We are a think tank. We've been advocating in favor of freedom and limited government and free markets. And you can submit proposals to Parliament to amend a piece of legislation. But ultimately, what politicians are responding to is a power incentive, which is they're not necessarily rationally deliberating over what's the most optimal policy outcome. They're going to be pushing forward laws that suit their agenda and their political imperatives. And they want to reward that small elite that's benefited from access to state resources and control over the economy. So I don't think that that's the way to go about it. You can also vote the rascals out, as in 2024, there was a big election, and the ANC for the first time dropped below 50%. They went all the way down to 40%. But the opposition, the erstwhile opposition, then ended up joining the ANC in a unity government. And as we were explaining earlier, many of those ministers, including the Liberal DA ministers, are actually continuing to comply and actually perpetuate these laws. So I think that's been very disappointing. So, I think we are putting a lot of pressure on all of the unity government partners to actually say, well, actually, if you're serious about rescuing the economy and the country, as you purported to be doing when you joined the GNU, then you actually have to bite some pretty hard bullets and actually start to, the reason South Africa is in the current state that it's in is because of damaging policies like trying to expropriate property without compensation, racializing economic activity through BEE. So you actually have to start, if you're serious about reform and growth and creating opportunity, then you need to start pushing back on these damaging policies. But the third pillar, I would say, is civil society resistance, so the work that we do. And other entities that we've mentioned on this live stream, like the Institute of Race Relations, who has a long history of advocating for non-racialism, as well as Sakeliga, which is really taking the fight directly to the state on BEE. But then what can you as an individual do? Well, obviously you can support these organizations financially. We depend on donor funding from many individuals who, even if they contribute a small amount, that really helps us advance our cause. And we can do a lot with very few resources, but we need even more. But if you can't contribute financially, I think this idea of non-compliance, I think, is very effective, particularly at scale. So when you're signing your home loan documentation, just refusing to submit your racial category and see what happens. You'll be surprised. You might get some clerk at the bank who comes back and says, "Oh, Mr. Emilio, you forgot to check the box here," and you say, "No, I deliberately did not check it." I've had similar conversations in the past, and
then I don't get a house.
They just well, that's the price you have to pay for liberty, Joe. Then so be it. But actually, sometimes non-compliance people they eventually give up and they carry on. So don't underestimate that. And I think the more people point out that the emperor has no clothes and point to the absurdity of the system, I think the more it will be delegitimized, and that also can filter through into the political process. And then the other mechanism is through the courts. And we, as the Free Market Foundation, we have a unit called the Rule of Law Project, which engages in strategic public interest litigation. And one of our big successes was we joined a case in 2021. This was before I joined the FMF, but Martin has quite a lot of familiarity over it. And this was a case run by Sakeliga against the then Minister of Finance, Pravin Gordhan. It started in 2017, their case, and the Rule of Law Project joined a bit later, and then there was a judgment in 2021. Martin can maybe clarify some of the details, but the case was with regards to the extension of pre-qualification criteria to all organs of state by the Finance Ministry, by National Treasury, which required that in order to even be considered for a competitive tender process, you needed to be 100% black owned. So even if you were 75% black owned, you were disqualified. And this had huge economic ramifications for thousands of firms that would be doing business with the state. And Sakeliga challenged the Minister of Finance there on a lot of procedural and substantive grounds. But the Rule of Law Project was acting as a friend of the court, as an amicus curiae, And our argument was that, well, actually, this is a violation of the separation of powers doctrine, which is an important feature of constitutional democracy and the way that our political system is established, where you need to have separation and of different spheres of government, so local government, provincial government, national government. And here we had the National Department of Finance extending all these rules to other organs of state. And actually, our argument there was persuasive to the court. This was the Constitutional Court, which ended up throwing out this preferential procurement legislation. So that was, albeit a temporary win. As Martin mentioned earlier, there's a new procurement legislation that has come out. But we think that that was a very effective way of, with basically the cost of legal counsel, actually pushing back against some of these more harsh, draconian rules, and unlocking billions of rands worth of economic activity. So that's a good example of the kind of leverage that civil society organizations like ours can achieve. Martin, do you want to add anything there?
Sorry, Martin, just before you do, David, if you could just touch on this as well, like speaking about supporting civil society and organizations and yours specifically, do you just maybe want to also talk about, sorry, that's the wrong, let me just get it out quickly.
Challenge.
Yes, the 1 million Rand challenge. There is a link in the description, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to go check it out. I think it's very important to maybe just mention it very quickly. Here it is. So let's go here, and there it is, 1 million Rand challenge.
Yeah, thanks for showing that, Joe. So every year at the beginning of the year, we run what's called the 1 million Rand challenge, and we have an anonymous donor, very generous individual, who's agreed to match any donations that the FMF receives before the end of February by 50%. So if you, for argument's sake, were to donate 1,000 Rand, then the FMF would receive an additional 500 Rand. So a total of 1,500 Rand. So that really helps our cause and also amplifies or extends your contribution. So if you like the work that we do, and I think it's very important work, particularly in the context of many of the opposition parties now crossing the floor and joining the government, that you have a balance of forces, that you have active resistance to harmful policies such as BEE and land expropriation. So if you like the work that we do, and if you're prepared to even contribute a small amount, you can do that through the online portal there that Joe's just showed. And yeah, if you would like to make a more substantial contribution, you can also get in touch with us, and we can make sure that you get a Section 18A certificate so you can claim that back for tax purposes. So yeah, we always like to minimize the amount of money that you pay to the state. So this is the best way to do it.
And do you accept Bitcoin for that?
We do, actually. Yeah, no, we have a Bitcoin wallet, and Bitcoin is an amazing technology. And yeah, we don't have time to get into all the problems with the monetary system, but sound money is a really important principle of a free society, because yeah, long story short, if you don't have sound money, you have rampant inflation and the debasement of your currency. And that's a form of expropriation in itself, that your hard-earned savings, like if you think of all those people in Zimbabwe who saved their entire lives and whose savings were obliterated overnight by rampant hyperinflation, they've lost their assets. So yeah, Bitcoin is a form of hard money. It's not just the latest trend. We think it's actually the future of money, and it's a way of also getting the government out of the business of money. Money existed before governments and central banks, if you think of gold. So yeah, that's a bit of a digression, but don't get me started on Bitcoin. I can see Martin's kind of girding his loins, preparing for a Bitcoin lecture from David. But yeah.
Welcome to
Nice.
David
This-
Ansara's TED Talk on Bitcoin.
I see in the comments, 1 of 44 says, never miss a chat from David Ansara and Comrade van Staden. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh,
I think that should be your new nickname at the
Comrade
FMF.
van Staden.
Like,
Really?
yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
I haven't.
Joe, do you want me to add something on the
Sure,
kind of what
sure.
we can do?
I just want to remind people to, again, if you have any questions, because I haven't seen many, but if we don't have a lot, then we'll just go through what we already have, just after Martin gives his little advice on how do we just get rid of these race laws.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of this was covered by David already, but the fact is that as far as race law in South Africa is currently concerned, it is changing, but as far as it's currently still concerned, is that a huge proportion of it is voluntary. You don't have to do it, but people do it, and it's the case that we kind of that David alluded to with the Minister of Finance and the preferential procurement issue is such a great crystallization of that. As far as now, remember, this was when the DA was still an opposition party rather than a co-opted ANC adjacent party. Their municipalities adopted preferential procurement regulations when they didn't have to. This was the liberal non-racial alternative to the ANC, and they still adopted essentially BEE in procurement when they did not have to. The Constitution itself, Section 217, says that you as an organ of state you may, if you choose to, you may adopt preferential procurement policies, and the DA municipalities, I think without an exception, all decided that they would do so. Now, that is the formalized opposition to BEE at the time. And then you know how South African companies approached it. They also overcomply. Still currently, I think it's probably going to change soon. BEE is only really relevant when you want to do business with the state. It's changing in many industries now, but for the longest time, it was about you doing direct business with government. If you do that, you have to have these BEE points. So it was only because big business wanted to do business with the state that there was this kind of cascading effect, because for their points to be higher, they had to insist that their own suppliers also comply with BEE. That pushes their points up. That allows them to get better contracts with the state. So this was all about voluntary compliance with a very nefarious system. Again, just to kind of echo what David said, if you want to empower Black people, nothing in the world stops you from doing that. You can just go and do it. Don't hide behind some law. If you want to have an empowerment initiative, please go do that. But this is certainly something where they hide behind the law. They tell people they have no choice. Think about this scam. The infamous letter scandal of the CEO of Discam telling people, listen, we actually don't have a choice to do this. We could get fined up to what is something like 10% of our annual turnover. So we have to not promote white people. We have to not appoint white people. What he omitted to say in his letter was that you can only be fined in terms of your own bloody employment equity plan that you voluntarily wrote and sent in to the Minister of Labor. So he wrote a plan, he sent it to the Minister of Labor, and now he told his employees, if I don't comply with that plan, we might get fined. So that was a completely self-imposed kind of regime upon Discam that he opted into, when his employment equity plan should simply have said, listen, we're a non-racial company. We believe in merit. We believe in equal opportunity. Our employment equity plan is that we do not really have one. That should have been his answer. But no, he wanted to comply. Many businesses want to comply. So this is happening to us because we let it. The other thing that I often kind of want to point out in these situations where it seems increasingly hopeless, where it's like race law surrounds us, expropriation is now a law, and that's kind of threatening the economy very seriously. Usually after that comes hyperinflation, what David just alluded to, because that's when things fall apart and the government tries to print money to make up for the collapsing economy. We are not North Korea, ladies and gentlemen. The people who oppress us, specifically in South Africa, I'm really talking, I'm not talking about the universal principle here. I'm talking about South Africa. There are some very smart tyrants out there. That is not the case here. The people who impose these things in South Africa are incredibly and certifiably stupid. They are dumb. They are dumb and they are incompetent. These people cannot hold a normal job if they were out of politics. So we need to start understanding that the degree to which our economy is being harmed and the degree to which we are suffering under a myriad of bad laws and policies is only the degree to which we allow it. And we're not saying go out and break the law. There are many ways to not comply with the spirit of some of these laws while complying with the letter of it. But you have to, and then David alluded to this at the very start of what he said. You have to mentally separate yourself from the state. You cannot have this, your point of departure cannot be that you owe something to the South African government. You do not. You are a free person in a free society. In fact, the government owes you a hell of a lot. So mentally separate yourself from the state. And with that mentality, a whole new world will open up to you. Everything, you will see everything in a different light. And then you don't need us to tell you, hey, you have to go and open a trust in this country and then put your assets in. Like, that is unnecessary because you will just see what you need to do once you make that what I've called mental state proofing, psychological state proofing. Once you separate yourself, your lot, the lot of your family, the lot of your community, and of your business from the whimsical and kind of passing dictates of what the political elite finds fashionable in the moment. Once you do that, everything becomes clear and a whole new route opens up to you. And in that way, that is how you push South Africa really towards prosperity. And what we didn't mention is that the FMF just had its Liberty First project, where kind of, not going to go into detail, but ultimately the course to prosperity has been charted. It is not like South Africa is the first country in history to deal with inequality and poverty and dispossession. These things have happened all around the world and they have been solved. And how have they been solved? Individual liberty, free enterprise, private property, and limited government. There is no exception. I still have a challenge that I've put out there for any person to show me one country in the world that has a free market economy that is also poor. I just want that one example, just one country in the world that has a free market that is poor, but no one can give it to me. There is no such thing as a poor free market. And that is the implications of that are significant, because I mean, if you don't really believe me, hey, let's try it. Let's do a free market in South Africa for 5 years, see if I'm full of shit, and we'll see. And you'll see unemployment solved, savings solved, lower taxes, more people will save, more investment, no expropriation. We will actually see South Africa turning into a construction site. These things work, and that was what our Liberty First project was about. Go to libertyfirst.org.za, where all the detail, it's all there. The course to prosperity is charted, but it only works. It only works if you separate yourself mentally from the state.
100%.
And you have to choose it. You have to embrace it.
Yeah.
And at the moment, I think it's safe to say that South Africa is choosing to be poor. Like there are so many opportunities globally that we can take advantage of. We have a significant mineral endowment. We have one of the most beautiful countries in the world that millions of people want to visit every year. We have a great location in terms of time zones for taking advantage of remote working opportunities. If you consider a country like the UAE, I mean, 50 years ago, this was just a desert with a lot of oil underneath, but they managed to capitalize on that. They realized that the oil was running out. They said, we need to be open to the rest of the world. We need to have a low tax burden. We need to be a place where people want to come and open businesses, attract the best talent. And the UAE, Dubai, has just taken off. Singapore used to be a swamp. It was strategically a good location. That's why the British colonized it and so on. But they suffered ravages during World War II, and post-war there was nothing really going on there. But Lee Kuan Yew, he actively decided we need to make this a competitive global economy, again, open to the rest of the world, open for capital, open for business. And capital goes where capital is treated best. In South Africa, we have this mentality that we can redistribute our way to prosperity. You cannot do that. So I think also very importantly is we think in South Africa, this is a fallacy again, that wealth is this finite thing, that there is this fixed pie and we just need to divide the pie up more equitably. But actually, we could grow the size of the pie significantly and create much more opportunity for people. But also, we have to confront this notion that we are responsible for our future. I think it's great that the United States has taken an interest in what's going on here, and the international pressure is welcome. But that might not last. A lot of other countries don't really care about this little South Africa at the bottom of the continent. So if we want to be taken seriously in the world, if we want to be a global player, we need to improve our domestic policy. So the best form of foreign policy is strong domestic policy. I mentioned the Singaporeans. Having a Singaporean passport is one of the best passports you can have, because everybody knows that people from Singapore are wealthy, they bring opportunity with them, and they're welcomed wherever they go. The Green Mamba, I don't think, is quite as popular a passport. And during the spat with the United States, you saw Gwede Mantashe saying, well, look, we've got lots of natural resources. We're going to restrict exports to the United States. Well, I'm afraid that's a bit of an asymmetric relationship. And I think both parties would benefit from trade, but I think we would lose out more than the United States would lose out. And to go back to our previous discussion, we've actually, in South Africa, sabotaged our strategic advantage by imposing ridiculous race-based policies like BEE. So South Africa has one of the richest mineral endowments in the world. We have 90% of the world's platinum. We have lots of rare earths and minerals like lithium. And we should be leveraging that. We should be pulling those minerals out of the ground as efficiently as possible and exporting them to global markets that are hungry for these resources. But we're not. So we're imposing things like the mining charter, which obliges companies to cede 26% of equity. They have to take all the risk of prospecting, of investing capital, of developing fixed infrastructure. They might not have energy security. And then afterwards, they then have to give away a quarter of their business to somebody else who hasn't added any value. And at the end of the day, a lot of global mining companies think, well, is this really worth it to be operating in this country? And maybe they go somewhere else, that's somewhere else in Africa, for example, where there might not be a state to speak of, but they have less onerous requirements of doing mining. So like if you think of the Congo, for example. So, I think all of these things are interconnected. And I think what I think is happening in South Africa is a very gradual realization that the policies that we have implemented have actually harmed the interests of this country. I think it could happen a bit more swiftly. And I think a lot of civil society organizations have been sounding this alarm for a long time. But I think the general public and the viewers of this show, they are independent-minded people who can think for themselves and apply a bit of common sense. And I think it's very clear to anybody with an ounce of common sense that South Africa's policy framework is fundamentally broken and we need to change it. And a big part of that is moving away from race-based laws and aligning ourselves with other countries like the United States who are saying that DEI is actually destructive, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is another form of race-based policy. And let's follow the mantra of Martin Luther King, who said we should judge people not by the color of their skin, by the content of their character and what they can offer. I think if we do that, then the sky's the limit for South Africa.
Mm.
100% couldn't agree more. Very quickly, there's not many questions. Let me just have a look here. I think we've kind of already answered this question somewhat. What would your guest recommend on ordinary freedom-loving South Africans to prioritize? Sorry, first and foremost. Martin, you want to take a crack at that one?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm going to be very selfish, and that is that if you're not already giving money to an organization like the Free Market Foundation, then please do so. I know a lot of people feel that if they only have 10 rand to give, then really they may as well not give it at all because it's so little. But really, if you're one of many, if you're one of 1,000 people who give 10 rand to us, that makes a difference. And even if you only have a little to give, please do. And I try to shy away from giving specific advice for people to how to state proof themselves, because if you kind of blindly rely on someone else's kind of advice on this topic, you could get yourself in a lot of trouble. That is why, for me, the what we lawyers call the conditio sine qua non, the kind of unavoidable precondition to get to starting this journey, is that you must tell yourself and you must believe yourself when you say, I owe the state nothing. I owe the state absolutely nothing. They are abusing me and my family and my loved ones, and I owe them nothing. Once you've convinced yourself of that, then you will start seeing what you need to do. But then, yes, then I would say start speaking to lawyers, start speaking to accountants about how to structure your affairs. We briefly mentioned Bitcoin. I think that people don't quite realize how much of a role Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies and crypto technologies in general are going to play in that specific kind of respect, how to state proof yourself against the abuse that's currently being done. So once you've convinced yourself you owe the state nothing, and start looking into those things. And I mean, we've now seen what kind of gets the ANC's attention in South Africa, and that is foreign attention. So if you, as many South Africans do, have connections with foreign communities, the British government, I know lots of South Africans have that connection. I don't. I'm an Afrikaner. I can only become a refugee in the US. Then please kind of bring some pressure to bear on some of those foreign actors to actually stop treating the ANC like some kind of porcelain doll that you can't really pressure. And I think if we start seeing more foreign actors getting involved in saying the Mandela magic has worn off, we're not going to play this game anymore, then yeah, I mean there is a future in which we have a more reasonable ANC. It can happen. It can happen, and we must do everything we can through the wielding of power, not through pleading, through the wielding of power to get the ANC and, of course, other parties there.
I would echo that by saying take individual responsibility as well. So that's the corollary of freedom is taking responsibility. And this idea that deliverance lies at the end of the ballot box, that some perfect political leader or party is going to come and save you. I think we should certainly engage in the political contest. I think it's important. It impacts our lives. But I think more important is building power outside of the state. I see in the comments people have been mentioning organizations like AfriForum. I don't think that's come up. We need more AfriForum-like organizations in South Africa. If you think of all the many problems affecting South Africa, from service delivery breakdowns to rampant crime, a civil society group like AfriForum is filling the void. And I think we need a lot more bottom-up solutions to South Africa's problems. So we need communities, neighborhoods, towns, people actually saying, well, we're going to step in and take responsibility where others have failed or have abdicated their responsibility. I think that's how any society succeeds. So I think state proofing is as much of a mindset as it is about investing in a borehole or a solar panel or something like that. And that can be even more powerful. So yeah, so I would say no one's going to save you. You've got to make a plan in South Africa. It's a tough place sometimes, but it's also a place where freedom thrives, and we can take advantage sometimes of the weakness of the state. Whereas if you look at during COVID in the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, you had a very officious government that would, if you posted something on Facebook about, how you were going to travel across state lines, or maybe you're thinking about not getting the jab or something, then next morning at 8 o'clock you got the police on your door. So we definitely shouldn't take our freedoms for granted. And there's a lot of encroachments on freedom in South Africa, but I think also the state in some ways is quite weak. And so what I would suggest is that this idea that Sakaliga puts forward of minimum achievable non-compliance. So don't voluntarily comply if you don't have to. Like Martin made that example of Discam. They actually went above and beyond to show that they're complying with this pernicious law. So rather don't do that. Rather see what mechanisms you can achieve without complying, and then you can start to resist from there.
100%. Gents, we're pretty much at the end of the show. I like to keep this to an hour and a half, and we're pretty much on the mark. So just very quickly, let the audience know where they can keep updated with what you're doing. David, you're the CEO of Free Market Foundation. You have a Twitter account. Tell people how they can get to know or follow you, and also you, Martin, as well. So we'll start with David.
Yeah, I'm at David Ansara on X, and best way to find out about our work is freemarketfoundation.com. Excellent resource there of all of our articles and submissions and policy proposals. Martin mentioned Liberty First, so libertyfirst.co.za, is that the URL, Martin? So that's if you want to go deep into some of our policy proposals that were recently launched last month. I would really encourage you to go there. You can download some of our reports.
Yeah, and for my part, on X, on Twitter, I am at Martin_ASFL. That's kind of for the last 2 or 3 years, my primary kind of communications medium. I am a Facebook refugee. I hope to one day return to Facebook. It is a far more hospitable place than Twitter is. But for now, I am on Twitter. I also have a personal website. That's martinvanstaden.com. All of my writing, my research, my books, my articles, my media appearances, they're all listed there. I kind of put all of my bad media appearances on there as well. I like to be very transparent. That goes for all the critics of the Race Law Index out there. You're not going to get me on trying to obfuscate or anything. So please have a look at my website and then find my work there. But yeah, then just again, freemarketfoundation.com. We have a YouTube channel as well. Where we try to keep active with more kind of short form video content, try and make some of these ideas more digestible to the audience. But yeah, please go to our website and really, really do consider if you can't give money, if you want to write something, please reach out. If you have specific expertise in a policy area, reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. Because again, civil society, the work that we do just doesn't work without civic participation. That it's really what it's all about. We have to get organized, we have to stay organized, and that you do that through institutions like ours. Thanks, Joe.
Oh, thank you guys. Thank you guys so much for being on the show and giving me your time and having this awesome discussion about race laws in South Africa. So, final question for you guys. Is South Africa the most racist government in the world?
It's a very tough question to answer. I mean, my gut tells me no. Interesting enough, I know people who know Julius Malema personally. They're very white individuals, and this Julius Malema engages in very genocidal rhetoric. But they say he's a perfectly kind of charming guy in person and so on. So I think a lot of it is theater. I think a lot of these people are in it for kind of personal gain, and they're just kind of playing some game. They're definitely exploiting ignorance and so on. But I do not ultimately think that. If you look at what's happening around the world, what's happening in China, where people are kind of targeted for ethnic kind of reasons, and elsewhere in the world where people are actually being killed for ethnic reasons. Every now and again, you have some flare up of ethnic issues in Africa, on the continent. We don't have that in South Africa, and we must count our blessings. And our government, I don't think, is that racist per se. And even if it was, again, they're too stupid to really do anything about it. And we must really count our blessings in that respect as well.
Yeah, and I think we need to differentiate between the government and society. And I think actually South African society, as a lot of polling has showed, like the Social Research Foundation, people actually get along with each other pretty well.
Yes.
And actually, if you think about it, and if you're honest with yourself, when you conduct your daily life and your affairs, your interactions are mostly peaceful, respectful, civic. You don't actually see that much racism in our country anymore, and that's a good thing. We have people in positions of power who want to weaponize race to their advantage and divide South Africans. But I think mutual respect for individual rights, non-racialism, these are the ways that we can successfully diffuse these divisive kind of strategies. But just one last word from me, because I need to get to bed. It's way past my bedtime. I think another way that you can support the good fight is by supporting independent media like the Joe Emilio Show. A lot of people like Joe, not just Joe, but
No, only me.
especially Joe.
Give me all the super chats, please.
Yeah, I think we've seen, particularly with this kind of Trump situation with the executive order, a lot of the mainstream media has really showed its hand. They do not often have the interests of South Africa at heart, and specifically South Africans. They're driving a specific narrative, and the real truth lies on platforms like this. So I just wanted to say a big shout out to Joe for all of his work, and keep it up, because the truth will set you free.
All right. Thank you so much, David, for the kind words. All right, gents, I'm going to let you go now. Once again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for this awesome conversation. And I wish you guys all the best, ladies and gentlemen. That was Martin van Staden and David Ansara from the Free Market Foundation. Please go check them out. They are an awesome group of guys. I mean, even got a comment here from Voot, who says, "Welcome to Liberty First, an initiative by the Free Market Foundation that champions the cause of individual freedom and economic prosperity in South Africa." Tarj T1 says, one of the best conversations I've ever listened to. Thank you, Joe and guest. You are most welcome. And Voot saying, "I enjoy the FMF presentations and talks." That's awesome. So do I. So please go support them, ladies and gentlemen, if you can. I believe there was a problem with the link. I will have that resolved ASAP. Please keep checking. If you're watching this after the fact, after the live, I hope it's resolved. It should be resolved. Maximum just a few hours and it will be resolved. So you guys, please go contribute, go donate to the 1 million Rand challenge. It's almost the end of February, so don't miss out on that. It's basically 10 days left to do so. So please go do that. Okay, cool. Ladies and gentlemen, I have to go. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you guys so much for the likes, for sharing, for the live chat, like being involved in the live chat. It's great to see so many people coming and just having a conversation and enjoying this conversation as well. Share this stream far and wide. And yeah, guys, I'll be back tomorrow with another episode from Newsflash. It's going to be an exciting one. We're going to be talking about the truth about who owns the land in South Africa. I'm sure I'm going to get some backlash from that, but I don't care because the truth needs to come out. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Joe Minio. Thank you guys so much for watching once again. I'll see you guys soon. I'll see you guys at the next one. Cheers.